Thanks for joining us for an instructional video on a Bible study we call, Are You Sure All Things Work Together for Good? One of the most famous verses in all the New Testament, I suppose, is Romans 8:28. It's also one of the most debated, not in theological circles, but in real life circles. Are you sure all things work together for good? A lot of people will be struggling with that very issue when you present this Bible study or sermon or however you use these resources. So I'm excited to share them with you. The way we've laid out these PowerPoint or keynote presentations begins this time with a look at the Apostle Paul. I believe he was the most traveled man in the entire Bible. And we're going to see some of the locations that are very familiar to those in your audience who are familiar with Paul's story of how he went into Turkey, he went into Greece, he eventually made it over to Italy. But he traveled around the world, and then on his last trip of freedom, after what we like to call the third missionary journey, Paul made his way back to Caesarea and then into Jerusalem. And there in Jerusalem, he ran into a lot of trouble, wound up being under arrest for his own protection and taken to a place called Caesarea. And so the first part of this study is just the background on Paul's travels and how he wound up in a pretty difficult place. Now, there's a lot of background information in the support material that you can download, but one of the more important little small points there is that Romans, the book of Romans, had already been written by the time Paul reaches Jerusalem, and he finds himself in a position where maybe he wonders if all things work together for good. So Paul returns to Jerusalem, and there we've got just a quick list of all the things that happened to him. He was arrested. He speaks to the crowd. He's protected because he's a Roman citizen. Interesting little point, the Lord encourages him. Do the research on that and you'll find that that didn't happen nearly as much as you would think. Yes, he got some miraculous appearances and some great messages from the Lord, but not very often. And usually when the Lord goes to the trouble to encourage Paul, something really bad is just around the corner. Well, there was a death threat discovered, and then the Romans decide to move him to Caesarea, and the Bible tells us, and you have to read it 2 or 3 times to really comprehend this, that 470 soldiers went with him to protect this one little missionary, preacher. What in the world is going on? Well, for one thing, the Romans weren't about to let anybody else mess with their plans. They were in control, and they always overwhelmed people. When they came to the garden to arrest Jesus, who had 11 men ready to fight for him, that's what they saw. They came with probably a couple of hundred soldiers. In fact, if you read John's Gospel and do the research there, you'll see the language was very specific that indeed indicates that it was a few hundred soldiers that came to the garden. They took Paul to Caesarea, and one of the reasons you'll see why almost 500 soldiers would be protecting Paul is the landscape of the Judean mountains. There are lots and lots of little valleys and little hills, and there are lots of small passageways on the road that leads from Jerusalem down to the coastal plain. When Israel was battling for its independence in 1948, the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was the bloodiest road in the entire country. It was very, very difficult to get any kind of supplies or troops from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or to get people from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv to safety, because there are so many of these little places where an ambush could take place. It's obvious that has a lot to do with why 500 soldiers would protect Paul. They just overwhelmed any threat to the enemy. And they finally got down to the coastal plain, and right about the time we're going to get to the modern day airport in Tel Aviv, the Ben Gurion airport, we're going to head to the north and go to Caesarea. And there we will see the ruins of one of the most impressive ancient cities you will ever find. It was the crown jewel of Herod the Great's building projects when it comes to cities. Obviously the Temple and the Temple Mount was his real pride and joy. But for his love of Rome and Greece, he built a city here in Caesarea that would rival anything Italy or Greece could offer. And he would there entertain his very important friends from those lands as they came into this natural seaport. Herod had a palace there. There was a temple to honor the Roman emperor as if he were God there. Huge stadium, lots and lots of modern athletic events. In fact, they held many Olympic-styled and gladiatorial games there in Caesarea. Caesarea was 4 times larger than Jerusalem. We don't read of it in the Gospels, and so sometimes we miss the importance of this city. This is where Paul was held prisoner. You might want to do the background on all the modern conveniences that Caesarea had and how, obviously, it's a very beautiful place built right on the coastline of the Mediterranean. And this stadium may have come into play in one of the passages in the book of Acts where Herod accepts the accolades of the people that said, "You're a god, we're listening to a god." And that's sort of a political slogan if you understand Roman history. And when Herod, the grandson of Herod the Great, accepted those accolades, the Bible says God struck him with worms and he died. Our story today deals with Paul, who was held prisoner somewhere in this ancient city. Now, this is not the place where Paul was held. This is a room underneath the stadium, but it's easy to remember that Paul was held prisoner here. And probably the thing that about this scripture that you need to slow down and read again is that the man in charge left Paul in prison for 2 years. He hadn't been charged with anything. He hadn't done anything wrong. But he was a political prisoner. He was sort of just a political football, and they just left him there for 2 years. There's no justice in this. Think about this from Paul's mindset, even from the other church leaders. This is the most successful church planner in church history. He knew everybody across all these continents. He had all these churches that he needed to visit. He had more places he wanted to visit. He had more things to do, and he's rotting away in a prison cell in Caesarea. All things work together for good? Are you sure? Well, this is a time where if I'm leading a small group study or if I'm preaching this sermon, and I point out Paul is the man who wrote the words that sometime really cause us a lot of struggle. That God is able to work good in every situation for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Well, I love God. I'm called according to His purpose. I hope you're the same way. Why do bad things happen to good people? And people have been asking that question since the first bad thing happened to the first good person. The beautiful thing about the Bible story and about being able to see Caesarea and about being able to sort of comprehend where Paul was and to let it sink in, can we see anything good from Paul's time in prison? Can we just kind of think through it in his life? I wouldn't have ever expected Paul to have seen the good that was going on. He could not possibly have seen all that God was doing. But I'd like to throw these examples out. Maybe you have some other examples and you can create a new slide for the PowerPoint or keynote presentation and insert it. Or if you don't like something we've provided, just change it. That's one of the great things about this presentation. It's very, very flexible. You use it as you see fit. But here's the most obvious thing. While Paul was in prison, he began writing letters. And those letters became 13 books of our New Testament. And so we get the book of Romans in Romans 8:28. We get Paul's letters to Timothy, and we get his letters to the Philippian community. We get all of those incredible instructions that have been so important for the church for now some 20 centuries. Paul had in his mind certainly that he was very frustrated that he couldn't get to all of the churches he had planted and all of those people. There were thousands, even tens of thousands. He could not possibly have imagined that because he was now in a different life situation, he would reach billions. Now that's all things working together for good. If there was nothing else, that would be enough. I like to think about Paul's friend Luke. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote the book of Acts. And Luke was not an eyewitness to any of those events except the last half of what we have in the book of Acts. Now, where did he get his information? He wasn't a disciple. He's given us something like 25% of the New Testament, and he never met Jesus, not personally, never shook his hand. Well, He had 2 years while Paul was in prison at Caesarea. Israel's a small country. I cannot imagine that Luke wouldn't have wanted to see the Galilee, wanted to see Capernaum. Luke's the only one who tells us about the great stories like the prodigal and many of the other parables. Did he interview people who first heard those stories? And what about the Christmas story? If it hadn't been for Luke, we wouldn't have known about the angels over the shepherds' fields. Did he go to Bethlehem and meet an old shepherd who still remembered that day long ago when he was just a boy? It's just a projection, but it's an example of realizing that God is at work in our lives for good, even if we can't see it. There would also be the fact that Paul became very influential in the circles he traveled in what we would call Roman circles. First of all, there were the guards who had to protect him. Paul witnessed to them. He shared his faith with them. We know from church history that a lot of those Roman soldiers became believers, and it was in a large part due to their passion for following Jesus that in 300 years, the entire Roman Empire was officially a Christian nation. Now that wasn't a good thing in my understanding of church history, because things became very institutionalized very quickly, but nevertheless, Paul's influence on the entire Roman culture, the entire culture of his day, was possible in part because he was going through some very difficult circumstances. That's enough to get the brains working. And if I'm in a small group or a Sunday school class or maybe in a classroom setting, maybe we now shift into some modern day examples, some personal examples. Maybe someone wants to share a way that something bad happened to me, and yet I could see later how God was working for good. These kind of stories will be an incredible encouragement to the people who are in the difficult part of their own struggle, and there's almost guaranteed to be multiple of those individuals in your midst as you present this Bible study. So use it. Use it to encourage. Use it to encourage yourself. And we're just glad you did. Well, that means you paid for it. So use it. Now let's start 3, 2, 1. There's almost certainly to be people in the midst of your presentation who are going through some very difficult things. So share this message of encouragement with them. Believe it yourself and be encouraged by it. And I want to thank you again for joining us today from Experience Israel Now.